History of comparative cognition. Background. Observing animals in their natural habitat often calls attention to interesting and unusual behaviors. As an example, early in the 20th century, early in the 1900s, inhabitants of the British Isles noticed that some birds were using their beaks to poke through the lids of milk bottles that were delivered to houses. By puncturing the lid, the birds were able to get the cream that floated to the top of the bottle, no doubt annoying the humans who had purchased the milk. The bottles were often attacked by swarms of birds as soon as they were left at the door, and there were even reports of flocks following milk carts on their delivery route. 1949. Because this habit started in a small village and spread across a large geographical region, many people believed that the birds were learning the behavior by watching other birds open bottles. In other words, social learning could explain how the behavior was transmitted so quickly in a population. The only way to verify that social learning explains the transmission of bottle opening by birds is to examine the behavior under controlled experimental conditions. This may occur either in the lab or in the natural environment, although many researchers favor the former because it is easier to control factors that may influence or bias the results in a lab setting, although that in itself is debatable. Either way, researchers examining the role of social learning in bottle opening behavior of birds would need to consider alternative explanations. For example, did one bird have to see another bird open a bottle to be able to do this? Did the birds have to interact in order for the behavior to be transmitted? Is it possible that individual birds were following other birds to a milk bottle, tasting the cream, and then approaching new milk bottles on their own, which they learned to open through trial and error? If the birds were learning from other birds, what conditions made this learning possible? This list is only a subset of the possible questions that scientists could ask regarding social learning in birds, and there is no guarantee that any one researcher, or even any group of researchers, will be able to answer all of them. Often new questions arise as research progresses and, in some cases, scientists return to the natural environment for more detailed observations of the behavior under study. This general approach of combining field observations and controlled laboratory experiments exemplifies the subject matter of this text, Comparative Cognition. Chapter Plan. This chapter provides a brief overview of the historical and intellectual influences that led to the contemporary field of comparative cognition. An interest in animal cognition has been documented for much longer than is reported here. Theories of animal cognition were presented by early philosophers such as Aristotle, 384 to 322 BC, and later by René Descartes, 1596 to 1650, among others. The approach in this chapter is to first define the hallmarks of research in comparative cognition, and then to focus on three modern scientific perspectives that, together, influenced the emerging field of comparative cognition. In doing so, this chapter outlines the intellectual traditions that laid the groundwork for the discipline. Students and researchers in any field must be aware of the intellectual and social influences that led to the development of their field. This allows them to place current scientific advances within historical context and to interpret the significance of research findings that are presented through published journals, research conferences, academic courses, or the popular media. An inherent component of any scientific investigation, therefore, is the understanding that research advances are built on prior work. Understanding these influences will facilitate further progress, and that knowledge of the past can direct future endeavors. For the field of comparative cognition, this tradition emerged from the work of early experimental psychologists who devised carefully controlled experiments to examine behavior responses to environmental events, the work of early biologists who were interested in the evolution of animal behavior and conducted studies in naturalistic settings, and the work of early cognitive psychologists who considered the underlying mental representations that might guide behavior. After detailing these historical influences, the chapter concludes by characterizing the modern interdisciplinary trends in comparative cognition and suggests some likely future directions for the field. Hallmarks of comparative cognition. Researchers in the field of comparative cognition study a wide diversity of species, employ a variety of methodologies, and conduct their work with many different academic and research departments. Nonetheless, the field is characterized by three unifying hallmarks. Examination of cognitive processes. Cognition, translated from the Latin cognosco, means knowledge or thinking. It is frequently equated with information processing, in that the study of cognition examines how humans and animals acquire, store, and process information. A more specific definition of cognition is the mental processes and activities used in perceiving, remembering, thinking, and understanding, and the act of using these processes. Any cognitive process, therefore, is internal. It happens inside the organism's brain. Although scientists have developed some very clever tools and tests to examine these internal processes, cognition is typically inferred from some behavioral measure. For example, in studying memory, a researcher may test whether humans can repeat a list of words or whether rats will return to a location where they found food after different delay intervals. The researcher then uses the behavioral data, for example, verbal recitation or number of visits to a food location, to make inferences about time-dependent effects on memory retention. Experimental procedures. Research in comparative cognition typically involves some experimental manipulation. Behavior that was initially observed in the wild is often moved into the laboratory for controlled empirical study. In other instances, researchers conduct experiments in an animal's natural habitat. One of the best-known examples is the study of European honeybee, Apis mellifera communication, by von Frisch. Von Frisch determined how honeybees indicate to other bees where to find food by moving food sources to different locations and then observing how the forager bees dance when they return to the hive. There are many other examples of outstanding research using this naturalistic approach, despite the fact that it is more difficult to control extraneous variables outside of the lab. Evolutionary framework. A guiding principle in comparative cognition is that cognitive abilities emerge through the same evolutionary process that shapes physiological traits, i.e., natural selection. Some researchers examine whether a given cognitive ability in humans is present in animals, for example, counting, planning for the future, or understanding social relationships among group members, with the goal of understanding more about human cognition. For example, if humans have unique cognitive abilities, what does this tell us about how this species processes information? In other cases, researchers compare cognitive processes across species with the goal of understanding how and why these processes evolved. It is important to note that not all researchers in comparative cognition study a variety of species. In reality, most focus on one or two, yet their findings are interpreted from an evolutionary perspective in that they reveal how a particular cognitive process may function in relation to certain environments. These hallmarks of comparative cognition are exemplified in research by Galef and his colleagues that aimed to explain why some male grouse end up with a disproportionately large number of matings. In the natural environment, grouse mate on leks, location where males gather and display by fluttering their wings, rattling their tails, and vocalizing. Females observe the males during these displays and then select the male grouse with whom they will mate. It appeared that females were making their mate decisions based on the male's behavior, but, despite extensive examination, observers could find no clear difference between males that would explain why some of these animals attracted more females. This led to the idea that females simply observe the mate choice of other females and then copy them. 1983. Galef tested this social learning hypothesis by studying mate choice copying of another ground-dwelling bird, the Japanese quail, Quarternix japonica. In a series of tightly controlled lab experiments, he and his collaborators recorded the reactions of female quail to male quail that they had observed interacting with other females. For example, in one experiment they determined which of two males a female preferred. Then, the female observed her non-preferred male interacting with another female quail. This observation session was enough to increase her preference for this male bird. 1999. In other words, watching a male bird interacting with another female makes him more attractive. Moreover, when females mate with these males, they lay more fertilized eggs than when they mate with males that they have not observed interacting with other females. This work helped to determine that social learning has a profound impact on reproductive behavior, at least in this avian species. Researcher profile: Dr. Bennett Galef. As an undergraduate at Princeton, Bennett Galef had planned to major in chemistry with a minor in art history and then begin a career as a forensic art historian. After attending courses in chemistry, physics, and calculus, he ended up majoring in psychology, not because he particularly liked it, but because he held the all-too-common misconception that it would be an easy major. His senior thesis examined concept formation in humans, and he graduated with honors standing and the requisite coursework under his belt, but only 2 courses in animal learning. It was only in preparation for his comprehensive exams and PhD dissertation that Galef began reading ethology texts, including Tinbergen's classic Studies of Animal Behavior in the Natural Environment, Tinbergen, 1951-1958. Through these texts, Galef found his passion for the burgeoning field of comparative cognition. Upon graduating, Galef was hired as an assistant professor at McMaster University in Ontario, Canada, where he stayed until his retirement in 2008. At McMaster, Galef began the research that would make him a prominent member of his field. In 1971, he reported the finding that rat pups learned to choose particular foods based on the food choice patterns of adults. The adults had been trained previously to avoid a tasty yet toxic food and instead to eat a far less palatable food. The pups, even without personal exposure to the toxin, also favored the less palatable, safe food, but only when they observed adults making this food choice. 1971. This was the first systematic demonstration of social learning across generations in a controlled laboratory setting. Social learning will be detailed in Chapter 13. Since then, social transmission of behavior, particularly food choice and mating, has been the focus of Galef's research. From his perspective, social learning lies at the intersection of biology and psychology. Galef has approached the topic as such, spending time conducting both field and laboratory research. He has served in important roles that span the fields of psychology and biology, including editor of the journal Animal Behavior and president of the Animal Behavior Society. His interdisciplinary framework has enabled Galef to develop new hypotheses and theories regarding the hows and whys of social transmission, evidenced by his numerous empirical papers, book chapters, and edited volumes. According to Galef, 2009, as I have told my students, probably far too often, I see a life in science as a marathon, not a sprint. Ask simple questions arising from clearly stated hypotheses. Use simple experimental designs and transparent statistical analyses, one step at a time, experiment after experiment, frequently replicating your main effect until you understand what you set out to understand and can be quite sure that, when others attempt to repeat your procedures, they will get the same results that you did, and if not, you will know why not. Influence: theory of evolution by natural selection. Prior to the end of the 19th century, prior to the end of the 1800s, most people believed that all animals, including humans, were distinct and that each species had arrived on Earth in its current form. This arrival was explained, most commonly, by divine creation. These ideas were challenged by Darwin's theory of evolution, detailed in On the Origin of Species, 1859, and The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex, 1871. Other scientists and philosophers had discussed evolution, the idea that one type of animal could descend from another type of animal, but Darwin's hypothesis of how this occurred was novel. Alfred Russel Wallace independently came to similar conclusions, 1870, although it was Darwin's published works that engendered excitement, inquiry, and controversy. Tenets of the theory of evolution by natural selection. The basic tenets of Darwin's theory can be simplified to the following 3 points. Variation. Individuals within a species display variability in both physiological and behavioral traits. Many of these variations reflect random mutations of genetic material. Although Darwin elaborated his theories without benefit of this knowledge. Heritability. Offspring inherit traits from their parents. Again, Darwin had no understanding of the mechanisms explaining trait heritability, which occurs through transmission of genetic material. Survival and reproduction. If a certain trait promotes survival or reproduction, individuals possessing this trait will have a greater chance of transmitting traits to their offspring. According to Darwin, this cycle continues across generations, such that individuals with the trait promoting survival and reproduction will begin to outnumber those without the trait. This principle is often paraphrased as survival of the fittest, in which fitness refers to the ability to survive and reproduce. The process by which inherited traits become more or less prominent in a population due to differences in fitness is called natural selection. Darwin's description of evolution by natural selection provided a theoretical framework for many fields of science, including modern-day comparative cognition. Put another way, if physiological traits are shaped by evolutionary pressures, so are cognitive traits. Moreover, if there are physical similarities between species due to common ancestry, there are likely to be similarities in behavior, emotion, and thought processes, cognition as well. Finally, the idea that humans evolved through variation and selection from other animals does not mean that humans are descended from chimpanzees or any other species of animal that is alive today. Rather, humans and chimpanzees both evolved from a common ancestor that lived approximately 4 to 6 million years ago. This common ancestor was neither a chimpanzee nor a human, and there is no reason to believe that it was more chimp-like than human-like. Adaptations. To examine cognitive processes within an evolutionary framework is to consider how a cognitive trait might improve fitness in a particular environment. Evolution produces adaptations, byproducts, and random effects, but only adaptations are the result of natural selection. That is, only adaptations provide some evolutionary advantage to the individual. Adaptations, therefore, can be defined as traits that improve fitness. These have been selected for because they increase survival and reproduction. Some of the organism's adaptive traits can already be seen at birth. For example, reflexes such as sucking. In other cases, input from the environment may be necessary for the adaptive trait to develop, for example, language. Finally, some adaptive behavior traits may not appear until later in life because they depend on developmental processes, for example, human bipedal walking. It is sometimes difficult to ascertain whether a particular trait is an adaptation because the fitness advantage it provided in the past may not be the same across evolution.